Hi everyone, my name is Emily Sherman. I just graduated from Barnard College at Columbia University, and I'm the managing editor for the Journal of Stories and Science. And today I'm going to be interviewing Alfredo Spagna, a lecturer in psychology at Columbia University who researches the psychological and neural mechanisms of attention and cognition, on cognition and consciousness. So thank you so much for being here, Alfredo.
Thank you for having me, Emily.
Thank you. So the first question that I just wanted to ask you was, how did you discover your passion for science, and what is your background?
My background is I'm a psychologist. I've always been interested in psychology since my adolescent years. It's been always something so interesting, and something that we knew and we still know so little, which is what drew my first interest in knowing what's going on in our mind. And initially, I actually was very interested when I was a kid, studying something as complex, maybe, but way more studied was physics and astrophysics and the universe and all this stuff. And until when I was 13, 14, that was my main interest. But then I started meeting, philosophy studies and, studying in high school philosophy and then psychology. And then, of course, Freud in the last year of high school. And that's how I got to psychology and thought again, yeah, this is as complex as the universe, but we really know almost nothing. And it was, mid 1990s. So we didn't even have fMRI, which was just starting. So that's how I got into psychology and then experimental psychology. So somewhat the old way of calling what now is cognitive neuroscience.
Interesting. Yeah, that's really interesting. I actually have come across a lot of neuroscientists who, and myself included, who were at first interested in like physics and astrophysics, and then before wanting to explore like the outside universe, starting with the inside universe. So
right.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
They're definitely not separated, but maybe they're studying as a separate compartments.
Yeah.
Ultimately, we're studying humanity or human beings.
Yeah, definitely. So how did your scientific interest change how you view the world on a personal level?
Well, that's $1 million question. It keeps changing. So maybe if you ask me in a year, I'll have another answer. But let's say that I was never sure about wanting to be in academia. Let's say that what I do now is I'm in touch constantly with colleagues as well as students every day. And let's say that the more I do this job, the more I work in academia, the more my perspective of how our life is and what happens in our life changes. Right now, definitely, it's been also a very interesting and relevant and critical moment, the one we've been through the pandemic, right? So thinking about how the world changes based on this current situation, which is a health crisis, but at the same time, how much the life of our students changed and how much different students had to adapt to different circumstances. Working from home was kind of easy for me, but for some students, studying from home was extremely hard and had a lot of challenges. So that was very, very important, critical for my thinking. Critical thinking about who my students are. So where do I work? What is the material I'm working on? And how I need to adjust constantly my teaching style and my mentoring style for these various circumstances.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's really interesting. You brought up COVID, and something that I've been thinking about a lot is how we see in the news with this pandemic, a lot of people sort of reject the science behind it. We see in with our leadership, there's a lot of misinformation going around. So, we sort of see this mistrust of science, and I think it kind of stems from this like elusiveness behind science and how it actually works. So do you have any ideas on what scientists on an individual level can do to change the public perception behind science and sort of get the public to trust it more?
Yeah, I'm very happy you asked this question because very often the burden, because you're I think you're framing the question very in a way that is very interesting. Very often the burden of understanding science is put on the audience and saying, hey, because people don't understand my fantastic Nature article I just published. And but instead it's actually the role is on the scientists in making science accessible. And we're not good at it because we're not trained for it, because there is very little in our curricula about science communication and how to make difficult things simple. It's actually the opposite. We tend to grow from a very simple experimental design to a very complex one, and we are trained to consistently deepen our understanding on a specific topic. In my case, attention, but memory, language, and so on. But actually what happens is that with this deepening of the understanding, it comes also a more complex methodological background and complex methodologies, which makes make our language even more difficult to understand to the public. But there is never, or very few programs have, a moment in which we train our PhD students and postdoc in making our language simple and accessible to everyone. So this kind of it clearly reflects on society. Around us, there is very little understanding of what's going on, for example, regarding COVID, because science progresses, has this constant process going on. And it's very difficult to keep up this constant building of knowledge on the public that maybe will read one headline or two headlines. And it's very difficult to keep them updated with the latest of the latest of the latest. So what do we have to do? We have to train ourselves in making things more clear, and in making clear the message that science is not religion. Religion is, it's something that keeps changing, and again, it's something that will keep changing. Again, funny that I go back to astrophysics and physics, but let's look at how many models they changed about how the universe works and how the planets rotate and so on, and they kept on changing all their models to refine them. This doesn't mean that they were wrong at the beginning, or not necessarily, that there was something wrong. It was just the knowledge that we had at the time. And in neuroscience, as well as in immunology and in medical sciences in general, we have to improve our way in which we communicate new discoveries as a milestone in a process that progresses towards a more clear identification of mechanism, molecular, biological, cognitive, rather than the truth. And therefore, now we know how this thing works. I think that that's very important.
Yeah, definitely. No, I agree with everything you said. And I was thinking of this idea where, so, in Nature and Cell and Science and these journals, like, they're not really widely read by the public, and they give you what they found. It's very structured, right? Like, there's an abstract, an introduction, methods, and then data. But I was thinking that what if, like, Nature or something also had maybe half a page written by the researchers themselves on just their day-to-day experience, or how this project came to be and how they thought of it, and then what they did, and like all of their trial and error stuff, to sort of just show that this is a human process. It's not just like robots working in a lab and then here's all the data. Like, there's setbacks, and it's just to humanize it. I mean, do you think that would be a good idea, or do you think that's too like mundane, or do you have any specific stories of like how you came to think of a research project that then you published?
I think it would be a great idea, and we should definitely work on it. If there's something that is amazing or that mesmerizes me about science, is that the contribution of everyone is always welcome, and must be always welcome. So any idea is good. It's really, any idea is worth, moving it forward. It's really fantastic. And now that we live in a period in science in which things that were thought as impossible, like open science, open data, sharing the data you collected for other people to use them. This was completely impossible 10 years ago, or 15 years ago. It was like, no, I spent hours on this data set. I'm not going to share it with you. Now, instead, we are in this moment in which the contribution of everyone is very welcome. So your idea is fantastic. We should definitely work on it. And I think it could help also scientists kind of work on their metacognition, right? The process of getting into a project. And that is absolutely fantastic. And we don't have any of that. What we have right now is, a system that kind of pushes us in publishing as much as possible, as fast as possible. That also doesn't help with the public, with the discussion we were having earlier about how much we can inform the public, because we are really running, trying to publish as fast, as high impact factor as possible, meaning in very prestigious journal. So your idea is great. One example that I can give you that is the project I'm working right now, which is kind of new to me, but it's extremely, I find it fascinating, and it's imagination. And I studied for so many years what attention is, and then I moved into attention and consciousness, right? Which is attention, we can all define it as our ability to select out of all the information we have in front of us, select things that are important because we want to process them better, and also ignore things that are not relevant, because right now I'm talking to you and I want to check my emails or my texts that I'm receiving. So I'm selecting, but I'm also ignoring stuff. And then the question was about consciousness. So whatever I'm paying attention to, it comes to my conscious experience. And now I'm conscious of your face on the screen. But only a few years ago, working with Paolo Bartolomeo, a colleague now in France, in Paris, we started thinking about what is imagination and how imagination relates to attention and consciousness, right? So imagination is kind of the opposite of what attention is, or somehow imagination is paying attention to a content that is not in the real world, but is inside yourself, right? So imagining means paying attention to something, that is the product, not of the monitor, the screen, the light, the sound, but something that is already in your mind. And I find this fascinating, and this whole project started during lunch. Going back to your point about talking about, imagine if we could do this thing, and we're chatting and like, okay, but what is imagination again? And this is how lots of projects actually start, with just conversations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really interesting, and especially with imagination, that's great. I feel like science is kind of like art in a sense that you kind of have to create something out of nothing. Like there's no really rules for how you go about designing an experiment. I mean, besides like the obvious, methodologies that are tried and trusted and whatever. But I think that coming up with something as imaginative as your project about imagination, it's really incredible, and it's such a creative process that I think a lot of people don't realize when it comes to creating scientific projects. So I wanted to ask you, what are one or two lessons that you've learned from being a scientist in a pandemic?
Well, the first one, I wouldn't say as a scientist, but as a neuroscientist. I don't know what a scientist in general is learning right now. But as a psychologist and neuroscientist, the first very striking thing is how much our methodologies are somehow not prepared for this situation, are linked so much to the laboratory setting that somehow we had to stop the great majority, if not the totality, of the projects that were ongoing in our laboratories, because we live in this setting that we love because it's controlled, that our laboratory excludes a lot of variables that may be affecting your data and so on. But in a moment in which we're in a pandemic and we cannot see patients and we cannot see participants and we cannot collect data, we were completely unprepared. And the fact that we were unprepared, I think, taught me to think more creatively about how I administer my experiments, how I collect data in an ecological environment. This was the most striking thing, to see how much we all struggled in thinking, so what? So what do we do now? We cannot see any participant anymore. And we started asking our questions as, is there any difference if I make this task and have my participant, record the data at home? And this was the first thing that was very impactful. Stop the research activity. The second thing is more of a teaching thing, and it's absolutely related, and is more a scientist of education, which is what I like a lot to be. And this was, again, the situation of students. So how do you teach the content you're used to teach in a completely different setting in which your population or your students are not living in a homogeneous kind of environment in which you know that all of them can attend your class, have a quiet environment, and so on, but instead how much you adapt your teaching methodologies for the most extreme situation, including having students 12 hours ahead of time. So taking classes that needs to be recorded, or watching them at 2 a.m. in the morning, and so on. So that those two things really are things that I will keep with myself forever. I will forever, for sure, think, is this project that I want to do able to resist a pandemic, and is this class that I'm planning to teach able to resist a pandemic? This is something that definitely will stay with me forever.
Wow, that's really interesting. Do you think that your colleagues and the scientific community as a whole will also take those lessons away and sort of plan projects like with, a backup plan, or just in case something like this happens again? Or do you think for the most part, people will just go back?
No, I think that there's no going back. In general, maybe globally we can think about it, but there's no real go back. And I think that also funding agencies like the National Institute of Health, the National Science Foundation, they will all require us to be more thoughtful when we think through about potential pitfalls or obstacles in the planned activities that we are proposing in our grant. Also, not maybe expecting another pandemic, but to be mindful about major things that can happen, because this is what just happened. And some projects are, for example, still ongoing, and but some of them are paused. So some NIH funds are now paused, let's say, and with that also the payments, some postdocs are not being paid, and so on. So that's a very, very important thing. We need to think through this one more time, for sure.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Well, it was so amazing to hear from you, and thank you so much for participating.
It's a good pleasure.
Yes, so thank you so much.